The tracking station on Athek-9 had been silent for 214 days when the first ping came through. Subcommander Voyan Reth was the officer on shift. He was also the officer who had signed the death certificate 7 months earlier, so when the station's designation blinked alive on his scope, a single short-burst locator pulse, regulation Terran format, repeating at 30-second intervals, he did not believe it. He rechecked the band. He rechecked the origin coordinates. He pulled the signal's embedded identifier tag against the Joint Operations Mortality Register and watched the system throw a conflict error it had never been designed to throw. Confirmed deceased, signal active. The name attached to the tag was Corporal Wren Hadley, Terran Frontier Survey, attached to Forward Observation Post Athek-9 as the sole human technical advisor to a 12-member Selvari Geological Survey team. Reth set his secondary arms flat on the console and stared at the display. His chromatophores, the pigment cells that ran in bands along his jaw and throat, a feature his species shared with certain aquatic organisms from deeper evolutionary branches, shifted from regulation slate purple to something closer to ash. That shift was involuntary. It meant his autonomic system had registered a threat before his cognitive centers caught up. He keyed the encrypted channel to Fleet Liaison. "This is Subcommander Reth, Orbital Relay Keth Voss. I have an active Terran locator signal originating from the surface of Athek-9. The identifier belongs to Corporal Wren Hadley. Hadley was declared dead 7 months ago, requesting guidance." The pause on the other end was 4 seconds longer than regulation allowed. 7 months earlier, the Selvari Geological Survey had been 3 weeks into a 90-day surface rotation on Athek-9 when the storm hit. Athek-9 was not a planet anyone wanted to be on. The Galactic Habitability Index rated it a 0.7 on a scale where 1 meant technically survivable and 0 meant open vacuum. The atmosphere was breathable but thin, 14% oxygen at the survey site, equivalent to a high-altitude plateau on a temperate world. The average surface temperature at the equatorial band, where the survey post was situated, held at -28 degrees standard during the warm season. The warm season lasted 41 local days. The rest of the year was worse. The survey team had been sent to assess mineral viability in the Northern Canyon system. 11 Selvari geologists, 1 Terran technical advisor. Standard composition for a Joint Operations Frontier Survey. The Selvari were a spacefaring civilization with 40,000 years of recorded history, advanced material science, and a homeworld that maintained a comfortable 22 degrees at the poles. They had never evolved on a world that tried to kill them. They were not built for Athek-9. No one was built for Athek-9. No one except, arguably, the Terran. Corporal Hadley was 31 years old, 5 feet 9 inches, and had the lean, dried-out build of someone who had spent more time in frontier postings than in garrison. She had been assigned to Athek-9 as a communications and sensor technician, a desk role, or as close to a desk role as existed on a world with no permanent structures. She maintained the survey post's long-range relay, calibrated the geological sensor array, and ran the atmospheric monitoring suite that told the Selvari team when conditions outside the habitat module had crossed from merely dangerous to actively lethal. She also carried a field knife, a 40-meter coil of braided synthetic line, a fire-starting kit rated to -60, and a pair of snowshoes she had fabricated herself from cargo strapping and a section of antenna housing. The Selvari team leader, senior geologist Mathan Doc, had noted these items in his weekly supply audit and flagged them as non-regulation personal effects. Hadley had told him they were tools. Doc had asked what kind of tools required a knife that length. Hadley had said the kind you hoped you never needed. Doc had not pressed the matter. This was a mistake he would later characterize in his incident report as a failure of imagination. He had assumed she was eccentric. He had not understood that she was prepared. The storm arrived on day 23 with no warning that the Selvari instruments could detect. Later analysis would show that Athek-9 atmospheric modeling was inadequate. The planet's axial wobble produced pressure differentials that cascaded into surface storms faster than the Selvari prediction algorithms could track. The storm hit the survey post at 3:40 local with sustained winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour and a temperature drop of 61 degrees in under 90 minutes. The habitat module's thermal shielding held for 40 minutes. Then the primary heating unit failed, a cascade fault in the power coupling that the unit's self-diagnostic had not flagged because the self-diagnostic was calibrated for a 30-degree swing, not 61. Then the backup heating unit failed because the backup drew from the same coupling. Then the atmospheric seal on the eastern airlock cracked along a stress fracture that the pre-deployment inspection had rated as within tolerance. Hadley was the one who found the crack, not because she was looking for it. She was checking every seal in the module, methodically, compartment by compartment, while the Selvari team huddled in the central bay and watched their breath condense and tried to calculate how long the residual heat would last. Hadley did not calculate. She moved. She found the crack at 4:18. She sealed it, not with the module's repair kit, which was designed for a different type of seal and would not bond at the current temperature, but with a section of her own thermal blanket packed into the fracture and frozen in place with water from her canteen. It held. It was not elegant. It held. By 4:30, the interior temperature of the habitat module had dropped to -14. 3 Selvari were in hypothermic shock, their bodies' thermoregulatory systems shutting down non-essential organ function, a survival response inherited from their aquatic evolutionary past that made sense in a cold ocean current, and was a death sentence on a frozen rock. 2 more were approaching the threshold. Doc was still functional, barely, his 4 hands locked around a geological sample case, as if the act of holding something could anchor his body temperature. Hadley moved through the module with a methodical calm that Doc would later describe in his incident report as procedural to the point of unsettling. She consolidated the 11 Selvari into the smallest compartment, the equipment locker, 6 meters by 4, lowest ceiling, fewest exterior surfaces. She stripped insulation panels from the walls of every other compartment, carrying them in armloads, fitting them against the locker's walls and floor with the precision of someone solving a spatial problem under no particular time pressure. She redistributed every thermal blanket in the module. She used the Geological Survey's backup chemical heaters, designed for keeping rock samples at stable analysis temperatures, not for warming living organisms, and arranged them in a grid pattern around the huddle of Selvari bodies, spacing them at intervals she calculated by touch, testing the heat output of each one against the ambient temperature, and adjusting the throttle until the thermal envelope around the group was as tight as she could make it. She did the math on the heater's fuel supply. 14 hours, maybe 16 if she throttled them further, but further throttling would drop the output below the Selvari metabolic threshold, and the 3 in hypothermic shock would slide from shutdown into failure. The storm, according to the monitoring suite's last reading before the antenna went down, was projected to last between 40 and 70 hours. She told Doc the heaters would last long enough. She did not tell him the actual number. She also did not tell him that she had already decided what she was going to do when the heaters ran out, because the decision was not something that required his input or his permission. At hour 6 of the storm, she checked the 3 Selvari in hypothermic shock. 2 were stabilizing. The chemical heaters and the insulation had arrested the decline, and their metabolic shutdown had leveled off at a point that was dangerous but not immediately terminal. The 3rd, Technician Ciro's Mar, was not stabilizing. His core temperature was still dropping. His secondary circulatory system, a feature unique to the Selvari, A backup loop that routed blood through the extremities to preserve fine motor function in cold water, had shut down entirely, and the primary loop was weakening. His chromatophores had gone flat gray, the color of a Selvari body that was no longer regulating anything. Hadley repositioned 2 chemical heaters closer to Mar. She tucked her own thermal blanket, the one she had not already used to seal the airlock crack, around his torso. She did this without comment. Doc watched and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She was giving away her own insulation on a planet at -14 and falling, and she did it with the same flat expression she wore when calibrating the sensor array. At hour 8, she rechecked Mar. His core temperature had stabilized. Fractionally. The heaters and the blanket had bought him perhaps another 2 hours before the math caught up again. She noted this internally and added it to the equation she was running in her head. The one that said the heaters had 6 hours of fuel left and the storm had at minimum 32 more hours to run, and there was exactly one option that ended with anyone in this module alive. At hour 9, with the interior at -19 and 5 of the 11 Selvari in metabolic shutdown, Hadley put on her full thermal suit. The Terran issue field suit rated to -45, the only piece of equipment in the module designed for anything close to the current conditions. She checked the suit seals, tested the heating element, verified her fire-starting kit, and coiled her braided synthetic line across her chest. She slid her field knife into the sheath on her thigh. She strapped the snowshoes to the outside of her pack. She told Doc she was going to check the external antenna array. Doc told her the external conditions were lethal. The wind outside the module was sustaining 230 kilometers per hour. The ambient temperature at last reading was -72 and dropping. Visibility was 0. The terrain between the module and the antenna mast, 370 meters of open ground, would be unrecognizable under drift ice and wind-packed snow. Hadley told him she was aware of that. Doc told her the antenna could wait. Hadley told him the antenna could not wait because without it the survey post could not transmit a distress signal, and without a distress signal the orbital relay would not dispatch a retrieval shuttle, and without a retrieval shuttle the chemical heaters would run out in 5 hours and the Selvari team would be dead in 8. She laid out the logic in 4 sentences. She did not raise her voice. She did not frame it as heroism or sacrifice, or anything other than the solution to a problem with one variable she could still control. Doc did not have an answer for this. The math was the math. Hadley went outside. She cycled the airlock, and the cold hit the module's interior like a fist, a blast of -72 air that made the nearest Selvari convulse and Doc's secondary arms lock rigid against his body. The airlock sealed behind her. The exterior status light on the panel went from green to red, and then the panel went dark, because the power coupling that fed it was the same coupling that had killed the heaters, and it was failing incrementally, system by system, like a body shutting down in the cold. What happened next existed only in fragments. The module's external sensors were down. The suit's telemetry recorder captured data for the first 47 minutes, wind speed peaking at 240, ambient temperature dropping through -75 toward -80, Hadley's core body temperature sliding from 36.9 to 35.1 degrees, heart rate climbing from 70 to 94, blood oxygen holding steady at 91%, movement vector bearing northwest toward the antenna mast at a rate that suggested she was crawling, not walking, because the wind would not let her stand. At the 19-minute mark, the telemetry showed her stop, core temp 35.8. She stayed motionless for 4 minutes, then she moved again. The data suggested she had found an obstacle, a drift, a crevasse edge, something the storm had deposited in her path and worked her way around it. At the 31-minute mark, she stopped again, core temp 35.4, heart rate 102. The telemetry showed a brief spike in her suit's heating element output. She had manually boosted it, burning through the element's reserve faster to keep her hands functional. The element was not designed for manual boost. She had overridden the safety limiter. At 47 minutes, the recorder went offline. Impact. Something hit her, ice debris, a fragment of the antenna housing, a piece of the landscape torn loose and accelerated by 200-plus-kilometer winds, hard enough to crack the recorder housing, slam her off course, and kill the heating element entirely. The last telemetry frame showed a sudden lateral acceleration of 6 Gs, a core temperature of 34.8 degrees, and then nothing. She did not come back. After the storm, when the retrieval shuttle finally reached the survey post 61 hours later, Doc and 8 surviving Selvari were found in the equipment locker. 2 had died, geologist Pale of Thun and technician Ciro's Mar, both from advanced hypothermic organ failure. Mar had lasted until hour 19. Thun until hour 23. The remaining 9 were in critical condition but alive. The chemical heaters were cold. They had burned out approximately 14 hours into the storm, exactly as Hadley had calculated. The Selvari had survived the remaining 47 hours on residual insulation and body heat. Their metabolic shutdown response, the same mechanism that was killing them, had also slowed their energy consumption enough to keep their core temperatures fractionally above the irreversible threshold. The retrieval team searched a 2-kilometer radius in expanding arcs. They found her snowshoes, broken, half buried in drift ice 400 meters northwest. They found her field knife, driven into a rock face at chest height, a marker, or a handhold, or both. They found a section of braided synthetic line tied to the base of the antenna mast, frozen solid, the other end trailing into a crevasse, field that the storm had rearranged into an unrecognizable landscape of shattered ice and compressed snow. They followed the line for 90 meters. It ended at a clean cut. She had severed it, deliberately, with the knife she had already left behind, which meant she had driven the knife into the rock face, cut the line, and then continued without either tool, into the crevasse field, into the storm, with her suit's heating element dead and the temperature at -87 and no navigation, no tools and no reason, by any number in any index, to believe she would survive the next hour. Corporal Wren Hadley was declared dead by environmental exposure, body unrecovered. The death certificate was signed by Subcommander Voyan Reth. Reth had signed it without hesitation. The surface temperature during the storm had reached -87 degrees. Wind chill put the effective temperature below -120. Her suit was rated to -45, and the heating element was dead. No organism in the Galactic Habitability Index survived a 90-degree differential beyond its equipment rating. The math was clean. The conclusion was certain. The paperwork was filed and archived, and Reth moved on to the next item on his shift report. 7 months later, the math was wrong. Reth stared at the signal on his scope. It pulsed. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Regulation Terran locator burst, identical in format to the one Hadley's suit had been transmitting when it went offline. The origin point was 19 kilometers northwest of the former survey site, deep in the canyon system that the Geological Survey had been sent to assess. Fleet liaison came back on the channel. Subcommander Reth, we are dispatching a reconnaissance shuttle to the signal origin, ETA 4 hours. Do not publicize the signal until we have visual confirmation. Liaison out. 4 hours. Reth sat in his chair and watched the signal pulse and tried to make the numbers work. 7 months. 214 days. Athek-9 warm season, such as it was, had ended 5 months ago. The surface temperature at the signal's coordinates, according to current orbital data, was -53 degrees. Not the storm peak, just the ordinary, everyday, background lethality of the planet. 7 months at an average of -53, with a suit rated to -45. With the heating element broken, 19 kilometers from the survey post, in a canyon system that no survey had identified as habitable. He pulled Hadley's personnel file. He had read it when she was assigned a routine review confirming qualifications, noting nothing unusual because nothing had seemed unusual at the time. Now he read it again, and the details he had skimmed past hit differently. Born in a region of Earth called Montana. High-altitude steppe, continental climate, winter temperatures routinely below -30. She had grown up in it, not in a controlled habitat, not in a climate-regulated dwelling, but in an unshielded structure on the surface of a planet that varied between -35 and +38 degrees, depending on the season. The range alone would have killed most Selvari. The file noted that she had completed a training program called SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. The description spanned 2 paragraphs and contained phrases like hostile terrain with minimal equipment, actively pursued by training cadre, and no predetermined extraction timeline. Hadley had completed the program twice. The second time was voluntary. She had requested it. Below that, a deployment to Kurgan 3, Terran Severity 7 environment, separated from her unit during a sensor relay failure. 11 days alone in a temperate jungle with aggressive megafauna and no communications. She had walked out on the 12th morning. The after-action report noted 9 kilograms of weight loss, a compound fracture of her left radius sustained on day 3 from a fall, and a self-fabricated splint made from equipment casing and paracord. She had set the bone herself. She had continued moving for 6 days on the fractured arm. The report did not explain how she had managed this. It simply recorded that she had. Below that, a frontier posting on Reth 4, he noted the coincidence of names without pleasure, where she had spent 3 months maintaining a relay station in a volcanic desert with 1 other Terran and no orbital support. Average surface temperature during their rotation, 58 degrees. They had rationed water for the final 3 weeks when the resupply shuttle was delayed by a logistics dispute between 2 member species of the compact. The other Terran required medical evacuation. Hadley did not. She had continued operating the relay station alone for 11 more days. Reth closed the file and opened the Joint Species Medical Archive. He searched for Terran cold weather survival data. The archive returned 47 documented incidents of Terran personnel surviving environmental conditions beyond their equipment specifications. He read them in chronological order while the signal pulsed on his scope, 30 seconds apart, steady as a heartbeat. A Terran infantryman on Kalvath 2 who had survived 14 hours in -65 conditions after his transport crashed, walking 9 kilometers to the nearest outpost with a fractured pelvis. A Terran engineer on the ice moon Drelby, who had maintained a failing atmospheric processor for 36 hours in -50 with no thermal suit, wrapping herself in cargo insulation and drinking heated coolant fluid to maintain core temperature. A pair of Terran survey technicians on the methane flats of Gret 7 who had sheltered in the carcass of a dead megafauna specimen for 4 days after their vehicle broke down, emerging sunburned from the chemical heat of decomposition, but otherwise intact. Every incident had the same structure: equipment failure, environmental conditions beyond survivable parameters, the Terran improvising, adapting, refusing to accept the numbers, and then walking out. Reth's chromatophores had settled into the color of old ash and would not shift back. The 47th incident was the one that stopped him. A Terran civilian, not military, not trained, a cargo handler on a freighter, had been stranded on an ice shelf on the mining world Koreth 6 when her transport vehicle broke through the surface crust. She had fallen 12 meters into a subsurface cavity, fractured her right femur. The cavity temperature was -41. She had used her vehicle's emergency flare kit to cauterize the wound, splinted her leg with a piece of the vehicle's roll cage, and crawled 300 meters through the subsurface tunnel system to an exhaust port from the mining operation below. She had waited there for 9 hours, keeping herself awake by singing. The after-action report noted that the mining crew heard her voice through the exhaust vent and initially believed the facility was haunted. She was extracted with moderate hypothermia, a stable fracture, and second-degree burns from the flare cauterization. She returned to work 14 days later. He cross-referenced the survival data with the Terran homeworld's environmental profile. Earth, class designation, variable, 0.3 to 0.4 depending on region and season. That designation itself was an anomaly. Most inhabited worlds had a single rating because their environments were consistent. Earth's rating varied because Earth's environment was not consistent. It had deserts at 60 degrees and polar caps at -80. It had oceans that could drown you, and mountains that could freeze you, and tectonic plates that could bury you, and an atmosphere that periodically organized itself into rotating columns of wind powerful enough to destroy habitat structures. The Terrans had evolved on this world. They had not merely survived it, they had spread across it, occupying every biome, adapting to every condition, developing the biological and psychological architecture to treat lethal environmental variation as background noise. The signal pulsed, 30 seconds, 30 seconds. The reconnaissance shuttle reached the signal origin 3 hours and 47 minutes after dispatch. Reth had not left the console. He had not eaten. The pilot's voice came through the relay, a Selvari, calm by training, but with a flatness Reth recognized as a mind encountering something outside its categories. Orbital relay, this is Recon 3. We have visual on the signal origin. There is a structure. Repeat, there is a structure. Recon 3, define structure. It's a shelter built into the canyon wall, rock and ice construction reinforced with stripped equipment casing, partially covered by snow. There is smoke. Smoke. Affirmative. Thin column venting from the top of the structure through a constructed chimney, stacked flat stones, mortared with frozen sediment, consistent with a small sustained fire. A fire on a world where the ambient temperature was 53 degrees below zero. In a canyon system with no cataloged fuel sources. There are also orbital relay. There are storage caches outside the structure. 3 of them sealed with flat stones and packed with snow insulation, and drying racks, animal pelts stretched on bone frames, 2 racks. The pelts are large, furred, and appear to be in various stages of curing. Recon 3, do you have visual on any personnel? A pause, then, affirmative, 1 individual standing outside the structure at the edge of the canyon overlook. She appears to be waving at us. Reth closed his eyes. He opened them. The signal pulsed on his scope. Recon 3, describe the individual. Human female, wearing its not standard issue, animal hide furred stitched together, layered. She's wearing wrappings on her feet instead of boots, and she's carrying something across her shoulder. A long shaft with a shaped stone at the end. A spear. She is waving an orbital relay. She's smiling. The retrieval team brought Hadley to the orbital station 6 hours later. Reth was waiting in the medical bay. He told himself it was procedural. He had signed the death certificate. He would need to file the revocation, but that was not why he was there. She walked in under her own power. That was the first thing. No stretcher, no assistance, no hypothermia protocols. She walked in wearing the hide garment the shuttle pilot had described, constructed from the pelts of something large, stitched with dried sinew using a bone needle she had made, layered and fitted with the kind of functional precision that suggested months of refinement. Under the hide she wore the remnants of her thermal suit, patched in 7 places with compressed plant fiber. Her boots were gone. In their place, wrappings of hide and braided synthetic line, the same line she had carried as non-regulation personal effects. She was thinner. Her face had the carved, wind-burnt look of someone who had spent months in extreme cold, skin tight over the bones, flushed dark at the cheeks, cracked at the lips. Her hair had grown out and was tied back with a strip of hide. There was a scar on her left forearm, long, clean, deliberate. Her hands were rough and cracked with the callousing pattern of sustained manual labor in freezing conditions. She looked at Reth. She did not look surprised to be standing on a station she had left 7 months ago as a dead woman. She looked like someone who had arrived at a destination she had always intended to reach, and the only uncertainty had been the schedule. "Sub-Commander," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I need to file a correction to my status report." "You were declared dead," Reth said. "I noticed. When my suit stopped transmitting, I figured that's what would happen. I would have corrected it sooner, but the locator unit took some work to repair." 7 months. 7 months and 3 days. Give or take. The chronometer stopped around month 2, so I was counting by the light cycle. Athek-9 has a 19-hour day. I kept a tally on the shelter wall, 437 marks. What happened after the suit recorder went offline? I got hit. Ice debris knocked me about 40 meters off course and cracked the recorder housing. I lost telemetry and navigation, and the impact killed the heating element cracked along the same fault line as the recorder. So I was in a dead suit, in a storm at -75 and dropping, with 0 visibility, and I couldn't find the antenna mast. She said this the way she would say she had missed a calibration window. Flat, procedural. I spent another hour looking for the mast, couldn't find it. The terrain was unrecognizable. The storm had deposited enough ice to reshape the ground. I had to make a decision. I could keep searching and freeze, or I could move to the lowest available ground and try to find conditions that would keep me alive long enough to figure out my next step. You chose the canyon. Lower elevation meant marginally higher atmospheric pressure and marginally warmer temperature. Maybe a 2-degree difference. That's not much, but at that point I was looking at 90 minutes before my core temperature hit the point where my hands stopped working. 2 degrees was the difference between making it to the canyon and not. Your core temperature was at 34.8 when the recorder died. That sounds about right. I was losing fine motor control. My fingers were going. I couldn't close my left hand all the way. I was crawling most of the time because the wind wouldn't let me stand, and crawling meant my hands were in direct contact with the surface, which was accelerating the heat loss. How far was the canyon? About 3 kilometers from where I got hit. I made it in approximately 70 minutes. My hands were non-functional by the time I reached the rim. I used my elbows and knees to lower myself down the first ledge. Found an overhang about 6 meters down, not much, maybe 2 meters of cover, and I packed myself into it with drift snow for insulation. Snow is a good insulator. My father taught me that when I was 7. You sheltered in snow, in a dead suit. At -75. The snow cave brought my effective exposure down to about -40. The suit's insulation, even without the heating element, was still functioning as a passive barrier. -40 in a passive suit with snow insulation is survivable. Uncomfortable but survivable. I've been colder. Reth was aware that his chromatophores were cycling. He could not stop them. You said the storm lasted another 50+ hours. I was unconscious for parts of it. The cold puts you into a torpor if you let it. Your body shuts down non-essential functions to conserve heat. I'd wake up, flex every muscle group I could still move, check my breathing and go back under. When the wind stopped, I dug myself out. Took about an hour. My hands weren't working. I used my forearms as shovels. She paused, not for effect. Just the natural break of someone sorting through a sequence of events that had been, at the time, a series of immediate problems solved one at a time. On the second day, I found the thermal vents. The canyon floor has a network of subsurface vents that push heated gas from the planet's mantle through rock fissures. The gas is about 8% methane, and the vent openings are warm, not hot, but above freezing. Some of them had liquid water pooling at the base. That's when I knew I could make it. The geological survey found no thermal vents. The survey was looking at the upper canyon. The vents are deeper, about 2 kilometers further into the system. I reached them because the storm pushed me further northwest than the survey team ever went. And the fauna. There's a burrowing mammaloid, about 30 kilograms, dense fur, subsurface dweller, feeds on mineral deposits and biological growth around the hot vents. I spotted tracks on day 4, built a deadfall trap from flat stones and a trigger mechanism cut from my braided line. Caught the first one on day 8. The pelts are remarkably warm. The meat is edible if you cook it long enough. The digestive tract produces acids that turned out to be useful for other things. Other things? Electrochemistry. I needed to repair the locator beacon, and the original battery was destroyed in the impact. I spent 4 months building a replacement. The canyon walls have mineral deposits with the right electrochemical properties. I identified them by taste, since I didn't have analysis equipment. I used the mammaloid's digestive acids as the electrolyte, and for conductors, I stripped the filaments from my suit's heating element. The heating element that failed. The one that failed, yes. I took the part that should have killed me and made it into the part that brought you here. She said it without irony. It was a fact, an engineering solution, the kind of observation a technician made about a repair. The first 3 battery prototypes didn't hold a charge. The 4th one did. I activated the locator on a 30-second cycle to conserve power and calculated the battery would last about 60 days. You picked up the signal on day 214, so it had been transmitting for roughly 40 days. Reth pulled up her medical readout. Core temperature 36.8, normal, heart rate 62, blood pressure within baseline, mild malnutrition, mild dehydration, vitamin deficiencies consistent with a restricted diet, frostbite scarring on 3 fingers old and healed. The forearm scar, the scanner tagged it as a self-inflicted incision, approximately 4 months old, consistent with draining a subcutaneous abscess. She had performed minor surgery on herself in a rock shelter on a frozen world. The lead physician noted, no intervention beyond nutritional supplementation and monitoring is indicated at this time. No intervention indicated. 7 months on Athek-9, and the medical summary was eat better and drink more water. Hadley looked at Reth. Sub-Commander, I know what you're trying to reconcile. You signed a death certificate based on the numbers, and the numbers were correct. The temperature was beyond my equipment. The duration was beyond any model. By every metric in the habitability index, I should be dead. Yes. The index doesn't have a coefficient for the part where I grew up in a place where the temperature dropped below -30 every winter, where I got lost on a ridge at 14 and spent 2 nights in a snow cave I dug with my bare hands and ate pine bark until my father found me on the 3rd morning. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I was cold. He said everybody's cold. Then he walked me home. She paused. Athek-9 was worse than that ridge, considerably worse, but the principle was the same. You find shelter, you find heat, you find food. You don't stop moving until you have all 3. And then you don't stop because stopping means you've decided this is where you die, and I hadn't decided that. Not on day 1, not on day 200. Reth looked at the tally mark she had described, 437. That meant she had scratched a mark into rock every 19 hours for 7 months, every single day, a record, a count, a refusal to lose track of herself. Walk me through the months, he said. He did not know why he asked. The data was sufficient for the incident report, but the data did not explain what he was looking at. Hadley shifted on the medical bench. She did not seem uncomfortable with the question. She seemed like someone accessing a filing system. Month 1 was survival, nothing else. I dug into the canyon wall near the biggest thermal vent and built a windbreak from stacked rock and ice. The first version collapsed after 2 days because I didn't understand how ice bonds at those temperatures. It expands differently depending on the moisture content of the snow you're packing, and if you get the ratio wrong, the thermal cycling from the vent creates stress fractures overnight. Second version lasted 4 days. I was sleeping in the rubble of the first one while building the second, and in the rubble of the second one while building the third. The third version I built differently. I keyed the blocks into the natural rock face and used the vent's heat gradient to create a controlled melt-freeze cycle that actually strengthened the joins over time. That one held. She ticked the points off like inventory items. Food was the second problem. I found the mammaloid tracks on day 4, but it took until day 8 to build a trap that worked. They're cautious animals, good instincts. The first 2 traps triggered empty because I didn't understand their approach patterns. I had to spend 2 days watching a vent opening, lying flat in the snow for 4 hours at a stretch until I understood how they moved. After that, I was catching one every 8 to 10 days. Enough to eat and enough to start accumulating pelts. You lay in the snow for 4 hours at -50 to study an animal's movements. Hunting is observation. My grandfather taught me that. You don't chase what you're trying to catch. You watch it until you understand it, and then you let it come to you. Month 2, Reth said. Shelter was stable. Food supply was establishing. I started working on long-term problems. Water was the first. The vent pools had liquid water, but it was mineralized enough to cause kidney stress if I drank it exclusively. I built a simple still using a flat rock heated by the vent and a collection channel carved into the canyon wall. Condensation. Slow, but clean. That took about a week to design and build. She touched the scar on her forearm. The gesture was unconscious. End of month 2, I developed an abscess. Probably from a small cut that got contaminated. Hygiene is difficult when your water supply is limited and your hands are cracked from the cold. I monitored it for a week. When it started affecting my grip strength, I drained it. Heated the knife in the vent flame, made the incision, packed it with a poultice I made from crucite mineral powder. It has antiseptic properties, or close enough. It healed clean. She said this the way the medical report read. A procedure, performed, outcome satisfactory. Month 3 was when I started thinking about the locator. I'd been conserving the beacon's housing since day 1. I'd pulled it from the suit and kept it in the shelter, protected from the cold. The transmitter was intact. The problem was power. The original battery was cracked and drained from the impact. I needed to build a new one. You're a communications technician, not an electrochemist. Every Terran who goes through SEER learns basic field expedient power generation. Potato batteries, saltwater cells, thermocouple rigs from scavenged wire. It's foundational. The principle is simple. You need 2 dissimilar metals and an electrolyte. The execution on Athek-9 was harder because I didn't have metals. I had mineral deposits. I spent 3 weeks testing different rock samples, crushing them, dissolving them in the mammaloid acid, and checking for voltage with a scavenged circuit tester from my suit. Most of them produced nothing. A few produced a fraction of a volt. I needed at least 3 volts sustained to power the transmitter. Months 4 and 5. Prototyping. The first cell held a charge for about an hour, then the electrolyte froze. I had to figure out a way to keep the cell warm enough to function without cooking it. I built an insulated housing from layered pelt and rock, with a narrow vent channel that drew just enough heat from the fire to keep the interior above freezing. Second prototype held for 6 hours, then the mineral electrode dissolved. Third prototype held for 2 days, then the conductors corroded. The fourth one, I used a different mineral combination and wrapped the heating element filaments in a resin I made from rendered mammaloid fat and canyon wall calcium deposits. That one held. 12 days of stable output before I activated the transmitter. Month 6 and 7. Waiting, the transmitter was running. I maintained the shelter, maintained the food supply, maintained the fire. I refined the pelts, learned how to scrape and cure them properly so they lasted longer and insulated better. I carved tools. I explored the deeper canyon system when conditions allowed. I mapped about 6 kilometers of it. She looked at Reth. Her expression had not changed throughout the entire recitation. The same flat, procedural calm she had worn when she walked into the medical bay. The same calm, he realized, that she had worn when she walked out of the airlock into a storm at -72. The hardest part was not any of the physical problems, she said. The hardest part was day 43. That was the day I finished building the shelter and establishing the food supply and the water system and the fire, and I sat down, and I didn't have anything urgent to do for the first time since the storm, and the silence hit me. The canyon was completely silent. No wind that day. No animals moving, just rock and ice and nothing. She paused. This pause was different from the others, longer, the first one that cost her something. I sat in that silence for about an hour. Then I stood up and started carving the tally marks, one for every day, because as long as I was counting, I was planning. And as long as I was planning, I was going home. The surviving members of the Selvari survey team were debriefed at Kethva Station 2 days after Hadley's retrieval. Reth attended as sector administrative liaison. He was not required to attend. He attended anyway. Senior geologist Mathan Doc gave his account in the measured, precise cadence of a scientist reporting data, except that his 4 hands were trembling, and his chromatophores kept cycling through patterns that Reth recognized as unresolved emotional processing. Doc described the storm. He described Hadley sealing the airlock crack with her own thermal blanket. He described the equipment locker, the chemical heaters, the slow grinding hours. He described watching Hadley give away her insulation to Technician Mar, an act that, Doc noted, reduced her own thermal protection to functionally nothing at a time when the module's interior was already 14 degrees below the Selvari hypothermic threshold. She gave it away, Doc said. She gave her blanket to a man she had known for 3 weeks without hesitating, without calculating whether it would improve his chances enough to justify the cost to hers. Or perhaps she did calculate. Perhaps the calculation was instantaneous. I cannot determine which is more unsettling. He described the moment she put on the suit. I told her the external conditions were lethal. She acknowledged this. I told her the antenna could wait. She corrected me. She said the antenna could not wait because without it no signal would reach the relay, and without the signal no shuttle would come, and without the shuttle the heaters would run out and we would die. 4 sentences. No emotion, just the variables. His hands stopped trembling. They went still, locked flat against the table's surface. She walked out of the module at hour 9. The airlock opened and the cold came in, and I watched Technician Vorik convulse, and I thought, she just walked into that. Voluntarily. At hour 9 of a storm that the monitoring suite said would last until at least hour 40. She walked out knowing she would probably die before she reached the antenna. And she did it because the alternative was to stay and watch all of us die instead. She saved your team, Reth said. She saved us by leaving us. That is the fact I have been trying to reconcile for 7 months. She calculated that her best contribution was to walk into conditions that would kill her, on the chance that she could restore communications before she died. She made that calculation, and she was correct. We survived because the retrieval shuttle came, and the shuttle came because Hadley's attempt to reach the antenna triggered a locator ping that the relay caught before her suit went down. Without that partial signal, the relay would not have dispatched a retrieval team until our scheduled check-in, 14 days later. We would all have been dead. She did not die, Reth said. Doc looked at him. The Selvari's pupils were contracted to pinpoints, a fear response, old and deep. No, she did not die. She walked 19 kilometers into a crevasse field in a storm at -87, with no heating and no tools and no navigation. and she found a canyon with thermal vents and subsurface fauna that our survey missed entirely. And she built a shelter and made fire and trapped animals and fabricated a battery from rock and acid and the wreckage of her own equipment. She did this for 7 months. She came back wearing the skin of an animal we did not know existed, carrying a spear she made from bone and stone, healthier than 2 of my surviving team members. She came back because she decided to. Doc paused. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the scientific cadence. It was raw. Every military species in the compact understands sacrifice. You spend a life to buy time, but what do you call it when the life you spent refuses to stay spent? Reth did not answer. He did not have a word for it. He suspected the Terrans did not have one either. For them, it was not remarkable enough to name. It was just Tuesday. It was just the ridge above the property at 14. It was just everybody's cold. Doc was not finished. "I want to add something to the record," he said. "When the retrieval shuttle brought Corporal Hadley aboard, the pilot told me she was standing outside her shelter, waving, smiling, carrying a spear she had made. I asked the pilot what she said when they landed. He told me the first thing she asked was whether the survey team had survived, not how long she had been gone, not when she could leave, whether we survived." He folded all 4 hands on the table. "We were the reason she walked into the storm. We were the equation she was solving. And 7 months later, after everything she endured, the first variable she checked was us." The debriefing room was quiet. Reth made a note in his file. He did not know what category to put it in. He put it under additional observations and moved on to the next section because the paperwork required structure even when the subject did not fit inside it. After the formal session, Reth walked with Doc to the station's observation gallery. Through the viewport, Athek-9 hung in the lower quadrant, a pale, ice-scarred sphere, the canyon system visible as a dark vein across the northern hemisphere. Reth had looked at that planet every shift for 7 months and seen a world rated 0.7. A number, a statistic, a surface that killed what landed on it. Now he looked at it and saw the canyon where Hadley had scratched 437 marks into rock. The shelter, the fire, the drying racks with pelts stretched on bone frames. A world that had tried to kill a woman for 7 months and had failed, not because the woman was superhuman, but because she had refused to agree with the planet's assessment of her chances. "Sub-Commander," Doc said. He was looking at the planet too. "I have served with 4 species in joint operations over 23 years. I have observed courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice across all of them. What I observed in Corporal Hadley was none of those things exactly, or perhaps all of them compressed into a single behavior that I can only describe as continuity. She did not perform a heroic act. She performed the next act, and the next, and the next, for 7 months, without any evidence that the next act would matter. She simply did not stop." Reth nodded. He did not trust his voice. His chromatophores were cycling again, and he did not try to stop them. 3 weeks after the retrieval, Reth was reviewing the incident file for final archival. He had read the engineering team's analysis of Hadley's improvised battery 3 times. The assessment noted that the design, while crude, was consistent with first principles electrochemistry and demonstrated a working knowledge of material science that exceeds the qualification requirements for the individual's assigned role. A footnote added by the lead engineer read, "The resin seal on the conductor filaments is particularly notable. The combination of rendered fat and calciumite deposits creates a barrier with dielectric properties comparable to commercial-grade insulation." Whether this was derived from theoretical knowledge or trial-and-error experimentation is unclear. Either explanation is troubling. She was a communications technician. She had built a working power cell from mineral deposits, biological acids, and the conductive guts of her own failed equipment. Through iterative prototyping across 4 months, in a rock shelter, on a diet of cave mammal meat cooked over a methane vent fire, The engineering team had also examined the shelter itself, sending a survey drone to the canyon before the winter storms closed the approach window. Their report documented stone walls 3 meters thick at the base, tapering to 1.5 at the top, with a ventilation channel angled to draw thermal vent heat while preventing carbon monoxide accumulation. The design was not primitive. It was engineered, adapted and refined over months by someone who had failed twice and corrected every failure. Reth opened a new file. The incident required a formal addendum to the sector's environmental hazard protocols. He wrote, "Standard mortality modeling for severity 6 and above environments assumes equipment-dependent survival, with a margin tied to equipment rating tolerances. Current models do not account for the capacity of Terran personnel to independently fabricate replacement survival infrastructure from locally available materials following primary equipment failure." He stared at the sentence. He thought about Hadley identifying mineral deposits by taste. He thought about her stripping the failed heating element for conductor wire. He thought about the 3 collapsed shelters and the 4th one that held. He continued, "Recommendation: mortality declarations for Terran personnel should require physical confirmation of remains. Environmental modeling alone is insufficient." He stared at this too. He thought about the signal pulsing on his scope for 40 days while a dead woman built a battery in a canyon on a frozen planet and waited for someone to notice that the numbers were wrong. He added, "Addendum: no environmental severity rating currently in use should be considered a reliable upper bound for Terran survivability. The Terran species' evolutionary origin on a high-variability Deathworld has produced physiological and cognitive adaptations that render standard habitability modeling unreliable when applied to Terran subjects. Recommend that all mortality assessments involving Terran personnel include a mandatory review by a Terran-qualified medical officer before finalization." He saved the file. 6 weeks after the retrieval, a routine personnel update crossed Reth's console. Corporal Wren Hadley had been medically cleared for active duty. She had requested reassignment to a frontier survey posting. Her new assignment was Athek-9. Reth read the notice 3 times. He checked the posting code, the sector designation, the GHI rating, 0.7, the same number that had led him to sign the death certificate. She was going back, not to a different world, not to a safer posting, back to the canyon system where she had spent 7 months surviving conditions that the Galactic Habitability Index said were fatal. She was going back because there was unfinished survey work in that canyon, and she was the only person who knew the terrain, and there was an uncatalogued species and unmapped thermal vents and mineral deposits that no one else had ever stayed alive long enough to find. Reth did not file an objection. There was nothing in the regulations that prohibited a Terran from returning to a planet that had failed to kill her. He wondered, briefly, whether the Selvari who would be assigned to her new survey team knew what they were getting. Whether they would see the field knife and the braided line and the handmade snowshoes and flag them as non-regulation personal effects, the way Doc had, and whether they would understand, the way Doc had not, until it was too late to matter, that those items were not eccentricities. They were the difference between a death certificate and a personnel transfer. He pulled the reassignment file and read the annotation at the bottom. Hadley had included a note with her request. Recommend expanded survey radius to include Lower Canyon System. Thermal vents and subsurface fauna cataloged during my previous posting require formal geological and biological assessment. I can provide detailed coordinates and terrain guidance. Previous posting. She had described 7 months of solitary survival on a frozen Deathworld as a posting, as if she had been stationed there. As if the planet had issued her orders and she had served out her rotation and filed her report on the way out. He archived the notice. He pulled up the sector's environmental protocol addendum, The one he had written 3 weeks ago, the one that recommended physical confirmation of remains before declaring a Terran dead. The addendum had been reviewed by 4 departments. 3 had approved it without comment. The 4th, the Mortality Certification Office, staffed entirely by Selvari actuaries, had flagged it for additional review, noting that the recommendation would require significant revision to established mortality modeling frameworks across 17 sector jurisdictions. Reth had responded with a single attachment, the incident file. The full file, including the engineering analysis of Hadley's battery, the medical assessment that amounted to eat better and drink more water, and the reassignment notice sending her back to the planet that was supposed to have killed her. The Mortality Certification Office approved the addendum the same day. He dimmed his scope. His chromatophores settled back to regulation slate purple, not because the threat response had faded, but because he had accepted that it was permanent, and the appropriate response was not alarm but recalibration. They measured what the world could do to you. They did not measure what you were willing to do to the world. And the Terrans, the species from the Deathworld, the ones whose habitability index varied by season because their planet could not settle on a single way to try to kill them, had been answering that question for their entire evolutionary history. Not with technology, not with superior equipment, not with any advantage that could be quantified and filed and rated on a decimal scale. With the flat, procedural, bone-deep refusal to accept that the numbers were the final word. Reth thought about Doc standing at the viewport, looking at the planet where a woman had scratched tally marks into rock for 7 months. Continuity, Doc had called it. She did not perform a heroic act. She performed the next act. That was the part the index could not measure, not the cold, not the hunger, not the solitude. The willingness to wake up on day 200 and scratch a mark and check the traps and feed the fire and adjust the battery and do it again. And again, and again, until the numbers caught up to the fact that she was still there. Reth turned off the overhead light. He walked to his quarters. He did not look back at the scope. The signal was not on it anymore. Hadley was not transmitting from Athek-9. She was already on her way back to finish what she started.